Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. I am making this video to talk about the bringing down of statues to Christopher Columbus, Confederate Generals. I'm a history professor, so I'm always really interested whenever there's something historical in the news, right? Something to do with history. I see that there's also talk about renaming some military bases that are named after Confederate generals. NASCAR banned the use of the Confederate flag. Recently, one statue to Columbus got beheaded, one got thrown into the river. The American Indian movement brought one of these statues down. And so what I'm seeing is that people whose ancestors were the victims of basically of the project of colonialism that Columbus started, who were obviously who were enslaved, who were the targets of the violence of slavery. These people, whose ancestors suffer under these systems, these people are demanding that these monuments be taken down because in a lot of ways, it's also a reflection of how we as a nation are still dealing with that legacy of that violence, of that colonialism. And basically what I have to say about it is it was about time. Bring them all down. That's what I have to say. So I already mentioned I'm a history professor at a community college, and a big part of my job it's to demystify a lot of what my students know about U.S. history. And in reality, most people know very little about U.S. history. We as a country have a very short historical memory, 10 years, 20 years. That was such a long time ago. Compared to other countries around the world, people tend to have a longer kind of historical memory. And I don't really blame people for not having a deep knowledge of U.S. history. What we learn in K through 12 is pretty boring. The way that it's told is um, kind of memorizing facts and dates and names. That's not a very exciting way of teaching history. And so when I'm looking at the way in my own experience and just by looking at the way that it's still done today, I see that one of the main reasons that we teach US history as a society, right, where we teach US history to children is to create good, loyal citizens, right? Good, loyal, patriotic citizens. That's one of the main reasons why we have US history class. That's why we celebrate a lot of the national holidays, 4th of July and all that stuff. And this way of teaching history, national history, usually tends to downplay internal conflict, right? A lot of the struggles and tensions that we had as a nation tend to be downplayed. There's very few bad guys, for example, in this way of telling history. So national history tends to minimize the crimes committed by those who rule the country. For example, we speak really greatly of, the so-called founding fathers are supposed to be these sacred figures who you just don't criticize, right? Much of our dominant history seeks to hide or eliminate the history of conflict in internal groups. So we often fail to talk about racial tensions, gender, sexuality, class. We have very little discussion about class and economic inequality. There's no class exploitation for the most part in our history books. The labor movement gets very, very little references. And so in this way of telling national history, minimizing all the bad things that we have committed as a country, we tend to not really talk about the genocide against indigenous people and the colonization. Instead, we celebrate the colonial process, right? We celebrate the Pilgrims and Manifest Destiny, westward expansion. And when we talk about it's slavery. We often talk about it as a mistake that we did, and then that we fixed and moved past, right? And not really try to understand how slavery, in a lot of ways, structured the type of society that we even have today, right? Um, and so in this way of telling history that minimizes conflict, we tend to silence the history and the stories of other people, right? So that, you know, we don't want to look bad, and we want everybody to love the country and have this image of, you know, the US is the greatest nation on earth. But what ends up happening is that we don't take responsibility as a nation for our past. And because our country's failures and mistakes are rarely recognized, we don't grow, we don't overcome our mistakes, we don't have a shift in consciousness in a lot of ways. Um, and we continue to repeat those same mistakes. We continue to live under the same systems, and to reproduce the same racist practices in the present. Obviously, things change and evolve, but we pretty much are dealing with the legacies of that history today. And so, because we tell such a simplistic, limited, and I will argue distorted version of it, of the nation's history, there are people who end up believing that the US is the greatest nation on earth, exceptionally good, always morally right. And these, we can say, good students of national history, or at least this version of history, tend to become fervent nationalists, right? Who take any critique of the country, of its history, or of its leaders as disloyalty or even as treason. Especially if you're a brown person, a person of color, the moment you criticize the country, you're told to go back to your country, then go south of the border, right? It doesn't matter if your people have been here for generations, right? Somehow there's only certain types of bodies that are allowed to be critical of the US, and people of color always, you know, not always people seen as valid, having a valid view of, or a valid critique of the nation, right? And so those who criticize a nation or want to change it are seen as almost as internal enemies, right? And this type of unchecked nationalism can often lead to violence against people who are seen as less American or as less deserving to be in the country, right? And again, because we haven't developed in our own education, in our K through 12, especially the critical skills to really look at our history from an honest way, right? In a real, with all its complexity, right? And so coming back to the tearing down, to the destruction of the statues to Christopher Columbus, to the Confederate Generals, uh, let's think about this for a moment, right? When we build a statue to someone, when we build a monument to someone, what are we saying? We usually say that, you know, this is an important person. Their memory should be honored. We build statues to heroes and people that we see as honorable, people who we should emulate, right? Or something special contribution to our society, that kind of thing. But when we look at Columbus, when we look at the Confederate Generals, there's nothing honorable or heroic even about what Columbus or the Confederate Generals did. Take General Robert E. Lee, for example. This guy betrayed his country, committed treason, right? Went to war and killed his fellow countrymen, all to defend the right to own slaves. He was a slave owner, by the way. Um, and so there's been a lot of resistance to bringing down these monuments, these statues. And those who oppose the changes, you know, in 2017, this group of white nationalists, you know, were trying to protect the statue of Robert E. Lee because the city had decided to take it down, I think in Virginia. Same thing is happening now. You see armed people trying to defend the Columbus statue. I forgot what state that was. And what they argue is that, well, we're defending our Southern heritage, right? Our history, from those who wish to erase it or rewrite our grand history. And in some ways, I can understand it, right? These people feel that their place in history has been shifted, their place in history is being decentered. And, you know, for them, the statue of General Lee, for example, stands as a reminder that this country was settled and created by whites for whites. And this is what we've seen people show up and say, right? This is a white country, you know, was created by whites, founded by whites, for whites, and everyone else is just supposed to be grateful and be quiet. They feel that their place, you know, needs to remain in the center, in the national history. It's supposed to be only about them and celebrate only them. And when we really look at when these statues were put up, they were not erected right after the Civil War, right? In fact, most of these came after the 1890s, decades after the Civil War was over. They were erected at a time of Jim Crow, right? Of mass lynching, tremendous violence against African Americans, against people of color, against in California and other places, you know, Native Americans, Chinese, Mexicans. And in a lot of ways, these monuments were always about terrorizing Black people in the South. The message here is, go back to your place. Don't speak up. Don't challenge authority. Don't try to have any sort of power, right? And so the lynching, right, was always a spectacle. It was always meant to send a message. When a body was hanging from a tree, the message was that you should not challenge us. You should not speak up. This is our land. We rule here. And that's the same thing that the statues to Robert Lee and others did, right? This is our land, and we will enforce our rule through violence. And so when we talk about today the need to bring these monuments down, is again because we want a different kind of world. We want a different kind of society, and the end of white supremacy, right? Basically. And so again, some might say, oh, but professor, you teach history. How can you say this? Why do you want to erase history? No, that's not what I'm saying. It's not an erasure of history, not at all. Museums, history books, documentaries, all should remember the names of Columbus and Robert E. Lee and should study what happened. But the monuments shouldn't be erected to them. You know, the monuments should be built in honor of abolitionists, of indigenous people who resisted colonization, of truly heroic, honorable people who were in the right side of history. And, you know, if we want an example, Germany has no statues to Hitler, right? They're not celebrating his work and trying to defend his statues, right? So we should not be celebrating Columbus or Confederate generals, right? So again, I agree. Bring these statues down and all symbols of white supremacy. Let's be on the right side of history. Have a good one.